Max Verstappen is the biggest name in Formula One, yet right now his future feels less secure than it has in years. That is the contradiction hanging over Red Bull after only 3 races. The team still carries the aura of a giant, the driver still carries the weight of a 4-time world champion, and yet the whole story suddenly feels unstable. Not because one rumor appeared out of nowhere, but because the results, the rules, and the mood around the team are all moving in the wrong direction at the same time. And once those 3 things start colliding, a contract clause stops feeling like distant noise. The hook is not hype. Mercedes has opened 2026 with 135 points, Antonelli has 72, Russell has 63, and Verstappen has only 12. At Suzuka, Antonelli took pole with a 1.28.778 lap. Verstappen started 11th. And Red Bull left Japan still sitting 6th in the constructors. But here is what the paddock is not talking about. This is not just a bad setup window or one weak aero package. Red Bull is trying to survive a new rules era with a fresh power unit project, while Verstappen is staring at a season shape that makes every summer contract rumor feel more dangerous than before. That is why this story hits so hard right now. Verstappen is not just fighting for points, he is deciding what kind of future he wants. Mercedes is fast. The 2026 rules are already under fire. Endurance racing is pulling at him from the outside. Red Bull still believes it can recover, but time is no longer sitting still for them. The real story was never about the lap time. It was about what happens when the fastest driver of his era stops trusting that the road ahead still leads where he wants to go. And to understand why that deadline suddenly feels so real, you have to see how brutal the first 3 races have already been. Red Bull is looking up at Haas and Alpine after 3 races, and that is the kind of line that should not exist in a season with Max Verstappen on the grid. The damage is not hidden anymore. Mercedes has already pulled clear on 135 points. Ferrari is sitting on 90, and Red Bull is down on 16, level with Alpine and behind Haas on count back. Verstappen is not chasing one driver either. He is buried in 9th behind Kimi Antonelli, George Russell, Charles Leclerc, Lewis Hamilton, Lando Norris, Oscar Piastri, Oliver Bearman, and Pierre Gasly. That is where the pressure stops feeling temporary. Suzuka made it impossible to dismiss any of this as early season noise. Antonelli put the Mercedes on pole with a 128.778 lap. Russell locked out the front row beside him, and Verstappen was left starting from 11th. The race only pushed the story further. Antonelli won, Piastri came home 2nd, Leclerc finished 3rd, Russell was 4th, Norris was 5th, and Verstappen could do no better than 8th. What no broadcast covered is this. The biggest hit was not just the finishing place, it was the shape of the field around him, because the cars ahead were not all from one team or one package trend. That is what turns this from a Red Bull setback into a championship problem. Mercedes has won all 3 races so far. Ferrari has stacked enough points to stay in the fight. McLaren still has both Norris and Piastri close enough to matter, and even the next layer of the grid is stealing breathing room from Red Bull every single weekend. Sergio Perez has only 4 points, Isaac Hadjar has 9, and the team is no longer protected by a second car that can clean up when Verstappen gets dragged into traffic. The standings look brutal on paper, but the real damage is in how many cars now stand between Verstappen and control of this season. Red Bull entered 2026 with Max Verstappen still in the car, but the team around him had already changed shape in ways that cannot be measured on a timing screen. Christian Horner was gone after 2 decades. Laurent Mekies had stepped in. The people who once gave Red Bull its clear chain of command, its political strength, and its sense of continuity were no longer standing in the same places. Nobody in that garage expected what came next, because when a top team changes leadership at the exact moment a new era begins, even small doubts start to feel bigger, and every weak weekend starts feeding a much deeper fear. The bigger issue is that Horner was not the only pillar that disappeared. Adrian Newey had already moved on to Aston Martin. Jonathan Wheatley had left for the Audi project through Sauber. Helmut Marko, the figure many inside Red Bull always linked closely to Verstappen's trust in the team, also left at the end of 2025. At the same time, Red Bull was launching its own power unit for the first time. Mekies admitted before the season that this project would bring struggles, headaches, and sleepless nights. And after Japan, he said Red Bull's difficulties were not coming from one area alone. That is not a quick fix message. That is a whole team warning. This is the part that changes everything. A slow car can be repaired. A bad weekend can be recovered. A damaged sense of trust is much harder to rebuild, especially when the driver at the center of it has already seen the people he relied on drift away one by one. Verstappen is now judging more than race pace. He is judging whether the people, the power unit, and the direction of the whole project still deserve his patience. And once that question starts living inside a team, the next problem becomes even more serious, because Red Bull is not trying to solve this inside a normal rules cycle. Max Verstappen saw this coming before the season even began. And that is what gives this part of the story its edge. He was already warning that the new generation of cars could pull Formula 1 away from the kind of racing he actually enjoys. Then the opening 3 rounds arrived and gave that fear real shape. This era is not asking drivers to attack the lap in the old way. It is asking them to manage when to push, when to save, and when to give up speed just to get speed back later. For a driver built on rhythm and instinct, that changes the whole feel of the sport. The 2026 package is small, lighter, and far more dependent on electrical deployment than the cars that came before it. Formula 1 says the power unit balance is now split much closer to 50-50 between combustion and electric power. Active aero is live on every straight. Ease and overtake mode can unlock an extra 0.5 megajoules when a driver gets close enough to the car ahead. On paper, that sounds smart. On track, it has already created lift and coast phases, super clipping, and sudden speed drops that drivers like Lando Norris have openly questioned after Japan, with the FIA now set to review the early problems. That is why the RB22 feels trapped by this rules cycle in a way an ordinary slow car would not. When the sport leans this hard into battery timing, drag choices, and energy recovery, even a small weakness can spread across the whole lap and turn racecraft into damage control. The data tells a completely different story. Red Bull is not only trying to find pace, it is trying to prove to Verstappen that this new direction can still reward the kind of driver he is. And once that doubt gets that deep, the next part of this story stops being about the car and starts being about the clock. Max Verstappen has a Red Bull contract that runs to 2028, yet the reason this story feels so dangerous is not the length of the deal, it is the part of the calendar attached to it. Reports through 2025 made it clear that performance clauses were real, and Christian Horner even accepted that they existed. The reported trigger was tied to Verstappen's place in the championship around the summer break, which means every weak result in the first half of the season carries more weight than a normal bad weekend. That turns Hungary from just another race into a deadline everyone in Formula 1 can already see coming. The detail that matters most is simple. Private contract wording is still private. Motorsport reported in mid-2025 that the key line for 2026 was staying inside the top 4 by the Austrian Grand Prix, then later reported that Verstappen could not trigger the clause once he remained inside the top 3 at the summer break, while Reuters said the exit path would have opened if he had been 4th or lower after Hungary. Red Bull has repeatedly refused to discuss the fine print in public, so the smart reading of this story is not blind certainty over one leaked sentence. It is understanding why the paddock believes the timing matters so much. That is where this story gets complicated. Last July, Verstappen publicly confirmed he would stay with Red Bull for 2026, which should have cooled the whole subject down. Instead, the poor start to this season has dragged it straight back into the center of the sport because timing can revive a contract story even after a public commitment. The clause matters less as a legal mystery and more as pressure on every lap Red Bull runs before the summer. If the team cannot change the shape of this season fast, the next question stops being whether people are talking and becomes where Max would actually go if the door opens again. Max Verstappen does not have one escape route in front of him, he has 3, and that is why this part of the story feels so dangerous for Red Bull. The obvious path is Mercedes, because the fastest team on the grid always becomes the first place people look when a champion starts drifting away from his current project. Toto Wolff has publicly tried to cool that talk more than once, saying he wants to stay with George Russell and Kimi Antonelli as things stand, but he also admitted last year that some conversations are simply necessary when a driver like Verstappen is involved. That keeps the door from ever fully closing, but the second path is what makes this story different from a normal transfer saga. Verstappen is not only being linked to another Formula 1 team, he is actively building a life outside Formula 1 that already looks real. In March, he confirmed he will race in the Nürburgring 24 Hours in May, driving driving a Mercedes AMG GT3 under the Team Verstappen Racing banner, and he has spoken openly about wanting to do it now while he is still at the right age for it. What Verstappen did next left his own engineers questioning their data, even while this Red Bull story was heating up. He kept leaning toward the kind of racing that seems to give him genuine energy back. The third path is still the one Red Bull is praying for. Stay, trust Mechis, wait for the power unit project to settle down, and try to turn a shaky start into the kind of recovery only a top team can pull off. That option carries the most loyalty, but it also asks Verstappen to believe faster than the car is currently proving anything on track. Mercedes offers winning form. The Nordschleife offers freedom. Red Bull offers unfinished business. He does not need to choose today, but the closer this season moves toward the summer break, the more those three futures stop feeling theoretical and start becoming a points equation. Red Bull does not have until Abu Dhabi to rescue this season, it has until Hungary. That is the hard truth buried inside the calendar. Bahrain and Saudi Arabia will not take place in April, so the next race is Miami on May 1st to May 3rd, and from there, the road to the Hungarian Grand Prix on July 24th to July 26th gets brutally short. One gap in the schedule might sound like relief, but it cuts both ways. It gives Red Bull more time to work, while also stripping away 2 weekends where points could have been recovered on track. That is a dangerous kind of breathing space. The numbers make the pressure even sharper. Verstappen is sitting on 12 points, which leaves him 60 behind Antonelli and 51 behind Russell before Miami even begins. Mercedes has already built a 135-16 lead over Red Bull in the constructors, and that changes the whole recovery picture because Red Bull is not chasing one fast car. It is chasing a front group that keeps stacking points every weekend. Leclerc and Hamilton are giving Ferrari real weight near the front, while Norris and Piastri are still close enough to punish any stumble. One upgrade package will not clear all of that traffic by itself, so the real equation is not whether Red Bull can improve, because of course it can. The real equation is whether it can improve fast enough to change the standings before the season reaches the point where every contract conversation turns serious. Miami, Canada, Monaco, Spain, Austria, Britain, Belgium, then Hungary. That run is short, unforgiving, and packed with weekends where Antonelli, Russell, Leclerc, Hamilton, Norris, and Piastri can keep squeezing the gap tighter around Verstappen. If Red Bull does not change the shape of this fight soon, the story moves past recovery and into consequence, and that is where the full weight of this season finally lands. Max Verstappen is now close to the kind of decision that can change an era in one summer. Not because one race went wrong, and not because one rumor caught fire, but because Red Bull has reached a point where the whole first half of the season is starting to feel like a verdict. 3 races have already redrawn the mood around the team. The driver who once made every title fight look possible is no longer being judged only by what he can save on track. He is being judged by whether this project still deserves the next years of his career. The calendar makes that pressure impossible to ignore. Miami is the next stop after the April pause. Then the run keeps coming until Hungary on July 26th. And that leaves Red Bull very little room to turn doubt back into trust. Verstappen has only 12 points so far, after 6th in Australia, a retirement in China, and 8th in Japan. Those results are not just leaving him behind in the standings, they are putting every coming weekend under a brighter light than Red Bull ever wanted. What no broadcast covered is this: time is now a bigger threat to Red Bull than one bad setup or one weak circuit. So this is where the story lands. One road points toward the team setting the pace. One points toward the kind of racing that still seems to wake something up in him. And one points back toward the garage that built his name, but now needs him to believe before the evidence fully arrives. That is why this season feels heavier than a normal title fight. It is not only about who wins in 2026. It is about whether Red Bull can give Max Verstappen a reason to keep choosing them when the season reaches the point where choosing becomes unavoidable. By the time Hungary is over, Red Bull may find out that saving the car was only half the battle.